Welcome. I love making textures on my pots. Not only is it a lot of fun to do, but it's also a great way to make sure that your pots stand out as truly unique pieces of art. Because, let's face it, we can all, do a basic shape of a vase or a bowl or a cup or something. But once you start doing textures, it will, by nature, become very unique because two people won't make the same textures. Even the same person doing the same texture twice, it's not going to look the same. So from that reason alone, it's just great to do textures. But also, I like to work a lot with glazes, as you know. And when you have these texture surfaces, the glaze have something to break over, as we call it. So typically some glazes, lots of glazes, will look different on the high parts and the lower parts because it just it pools up in the grooves and it runs off at the heights and just creates these beautiful and interesting textures. This, by the way, as well as this one, is wood fires. But even ones like this that is used just with a normal glaze, I did use a copper carbonate wash to try and highlight the grooves in this texture. Becomes so much more interesting than it would have been just if it was like a pot with no textures. There's a million ways that you can do textures, unlimited ways you can do textures. But in this video, I'll show you 5 great ways that I found to make textures, and hopefully it can inspire you too. So let's go to the studio. Before we move into the studio, I just want to talk about the different ways that you can do textures on your pot. There are basically 2 different kinds. One of them, you make your pot, you trim it if you want to trim it, but you sort of finish the shape, and then you carve out the textures you want. That's what I did, for example, for this, one of my bigger pots. It was completely shaped, finished. Then I did the carving, and that's how it turned out. A different, it's a little bit heavy. A different category is when you start out with a cylinder, a straight cylinder, and then you do some sort of texturing, and then you expand it. By doing so, the textures will kind of also expand. This one is a good example. I thrown it straight up and down. I made this very heavy texture, and then I expanded it. Not so much for this one, but it helped create like a swirl and some extra drama to the texture. It's the same thing I did with this one, and actually also this one. I like to use that method for pots that have sort of this size and this sort of shape. For the bigger pots that I make in sections, it's not possible to expand them as much. So I typically use the carving method instead. In this video, I will be focusing on the, let's call them just expandable textures and how you can do that. I'll show you 5 different ways of making textures, or to be more precise, 5 different strategies or techniques for making textures, because the exact way that I do the textures is going to be different for you. So the first one we're going to do is probably the most simple one. Always we start out with a cylinder, and then we're going to carve in to the cylinder. And then when we expand, hopefully it's going to bend a little bit, but also these textures are going to grow. And that's a very simple way. You can use a lot of things to do these textures. Let me just get one of my tools here. You could carve into it with a flute kind of tool. This is from Mud Tools, very nice for that. But you can also just use regular trimming tools. And for this particular one, I think I'm going to use this round one. It's very sharp, very nice. And you can make some nice round ones, horizontal ones or vertical ones. And when that expands, it could end up looking really nice. But try out different tools for that. As long as it's something that can cut into the clay part of it, all of it, maybe straight up and down, maybe a little bit, what do you call it, with an angle, or you can do it any way you want. But I'm just going to show you one way. So this is a good example of a technique that I'm going to show you an example, but please, try all kinds of tools, try this. So let's move on to actually throwing the pot. The first step, as always, is to decide what clay you want to use. Theoretically, you can use any kind of clay, but if you want to cut textures that are sharp, then it's a good idea to use a clay that doesn't have too much grog in it. Maybe none, or at least if it has, that it's relatively fine particles. This is a stoneware from Jordan Schneider in Germany. It does have 25% grog, but it's very, very fine, so it doesn't feel groggy, and I can cut really sharp edges. And it's also a really nice clay to throw. The only downside with this clay is that it's to have a sort of a boring color in itself. Glazes looks really good on it, but if you have areas with raw clay, it's not so interesting. But you can use an engrope or slip or something to color that part, so it's not a big problem. So no matter what kind of texture you're going to do with this expandable technique, you always start out with a cylinder. So let's start out with that. Depending on what kind of texture you want to do, you always want to leave the walls a little bit thicker because we are going to cut into the clay, and if you keep them very, very thin, if you throw very thin, you won't have so much to cut away, and then you won't have very deep textures. And as I like really deep textures, I keep the sides at maybe a little less than a centimeter, maybe 3/4 of a centimeter or something. Also, it depends on how much you want to expand it, but because as you expand, the thickness of the wall is going to be thinner, and also where you cut out, where you carved into it, or how you textured into it, it's going to get even thinner. So you're going to leave enough space for that to be able to be done. So I will do something that is probably going to be something like a bowl-ish kind of thing. And so I'm not going to make this super high. It's also only a little more than a kilo of clay. Maybe a little more, but like that. One thing you also want to make sure is that the walls are equal in thickness. Because if there's areas where, especially if there's areas where it's too thin, then you're going to cut through when you start doing the textures. I'm not too worried about the top because for this particular type of bowl that I'm going to make, I'm not going to let the texture go all the way to the top. I will, however, leave quite a lot of clay up here because we are going to expand it into a bowl. So if I don't leave enough clay, then it will just get too thin. So now we got the basic shape of it. Just want to clean my bat. I think my bat is a little bit wobbly. This is not so good, but it works. Then I just want to make sure that it's completely straight. I use this rather stiff metal rib. And just scrape off the slip. So now we have a straight cylinder with a straight wall, and I'm just gonna take out any moist from the inside. And now theoretically you could cut it. I like to have it a little bit dried. I'm not gonna put it aside. I'm too impatient for that, so I'm just gonna use the blow dryer. Now, I think it's dry enough. I don't really want it leather hard or dry in any way. I just didn't want it to be too sticky. And so I'm going to start from the bottom, and then I'm going to stop just like a centimeter or something from the top. Something like that. Maybe actually a little bit deeper. Something like that. I'm just going to turn it around. You have to do it in like one go. Don't stop on the way and try and make it as, straight as possible. It doesn't matter if it's not completely even, because you're going to stretch it out anyway, and it actually looks very charming when there's a little bit of variation to it. So, something like this. I sometimes keep my hands on the inside just to kind of secure that I don't press in the walls too much, and also gives me a feeling of how deep I can go. It's okay. You want to try and make sure that the depth of the texture you're making is almost the same, because otherwise, if some of them go much deeper, then they're gonna break when you expand it. Oh, that one didn't turn out so well. It's okay. And now when you're getting close to the end, you have to decide how many you can do. Something like that. And of course, all this clay, you can just wedge up and use right away. You don't even need to reclaim it or anything. So now we have this. And well, this actually is still sort of circular. In case it's not, you can still adjust that a little bit. Now we are ready to expand it. One thing all these pots have in common is the fact that once you start doing the carving on the outside, you cannot touch it anymore on the outside. And that's sort of the first challenge with this technique, because now you can only attack the clay from the inside. In other words, you can only expand it. So if you make it too wide, there's nothing to do about that. So you're gonna go slowly with this. Another thing that I've found is that sometimes it curves a lot. So when you expand it, these lines will kind of swirl around, and sometimes not. What I found is, and I'm not even sure if that's correct, but what I found is that when it's very wet inside, there's very little torque, and they won't bend as much. And when it's a little more dry in here, you create more torque, and they will bend more. I'm not sure if that theory holds, but I think at least that works for me. So I'm going to leave it pretty dry on the inside for now. I'm just slowly going to expand it. And I'm holding a little bit back on the rim. So see, it's already doing something. And now you have to be careful, because depending on how thick it is, you can expand it a lot or a little. In this case, I actually made it quite thick, which is great, because then we can expand it more. You may also want to use a rib. I sometimes use that. It's easier to apply a little more of a even pressure. So let's try and do that. And also, using this rim, you will have a button that kind of follows this if you just push it down, and that creates a nice shape for the bowl. The downside of using the rib is that it can be a little more difficult to have a feel with how thin it gets. But now, you see, it's already getting really interesting. But I think we can expand it a lot more. With this kind of method, most often you end up with a rim. You can also see it now that it's not completely even. But given the fact of the crazy textures and stuff, I think that's sort of the charm. I mean, it's okay. It doesn't have to be completely even. Again, as I start out saying, what you do with textures is creating something really original and unique. So I don't personally want it to look fabricated. It doesn't have. I deliberately don't want it to look like it came out of a factory. I want it to look handmade, and so I don't mind that the rim gets a little uneven. You could cut it out in the end if you want something completely even. I don't. When it comes to shaping a bowl, there's a functional issue. And I remember when I started making bowls, I like these shapes where it goes in a little bit. It's a beautiful shape. But then my girlfriend was like, "We can't stack them in the kitchen. So you have to keep them open so we can stack them." And she's got a point. So now I'm actually making them a little more open so you can stack them. So I think we're getting close to the end here. I just want to take this. This sponge, by the way, from Mud Tools, is not very good at soaking up water, but it's very, very fine surface. So it's very good for smoothing things like the edge here. I do want to make a foot on this one. And so like the last maybe centimeter or a little less is going to remove the texture from. So I'm just using my finger to take some of it. Also, it's going to work as a glaze catcher, because that's a problem with textures. Because the glaze is going to pool up in the cuts, it tends to run a little more. So it's good to have sort of a glaze catcher down here. So I think that's about it. So you see, it's also a really fast way of making them. And now you can sort of feel how thick is it. And actually, I could have made it. That's sort of in trial and error. I think I could have made it a little bit bigger. And as you can see, they actually did swirl a little bit. And again, this was done on a very dry inside. There might be little pieces of clay. Don't remove it now, because it's just going to smudge into it. Let it dry. Then when it's dry, it's very easy to remove it. I'm just going to perfect the inside. I think actually I can expand the top just a little bit more. The thing is, of course, the weight is not going to change, because I'm not gonna trim it on the outside. I could trim it on the inside, but I'm not going to do that. But the bigger it gets, the lighter it will be per size, sort of, if it makes sense. And now, I don't know if you can see, but now the clay is stretching out and beginning to crack a little bit, which is perfect. It's not. It is super thin now in the grooves, so I don't think I can expand it anymore. At least not if I want a pot without holes, and that's what I do. So now I'm just gonna smooth the inside, and that's it. Do you like the surface? One of the challenges with carved pots is that they very often end up, or any kind of textured pot, they end up being a little bit too heavy. And I don't know for sure, because I haven't taken it off the bat yet. But when I feel here, it's very thin where I carved out, but it's of course thicker here. And when I check the bottom, it is still a little bit thick. I could, of course, cut it out in the bottom, doing the foot, but then I would lose out this beautiful pattern that I have. So instead, I'm going to do something that a lot of potters are going to tell you, you can't do or you shouldn't do, blah, blah, blah. I do it anyway. That's trimming the inside of the bowl. The tricky part about trimming the inside of the bowl is that the trimmings fall down. And if it's too wet, then of course they're gonna glue to the pot and make a mess. It doesn't look good. So they have to be a little more dry, on the dry side of leather heart when you do this. And you have to pick up the trimmings on the way, because otherwise you just smudge them into the pot, and of course you don't want that. But this is also a good solution if you end up with this shoulder. Sometimes in this area here you end up with a little bit of bowl. I didn't hear, it's actually nice and round, but you end up having this, well, we call it a shoulder here. It doesn't look so nice. Now I'm just checking again. I still have a little bit of extra clay in this corner here. So I will see if I can take some of that. Which also means that I need to go all the way into the center. Otherwise it's going to go up in the center. And of course, I don't want that. Be careful not to try and wipe it out. If it sticks, just leave it. Otherwise it's smudged into the pot. At this point, you need to decide whether you want to try and smooth it or you're going to leave these trimming marks. I actually like it because I'm going to use a glaze that breaks over these edges and actually looks nice. So I'm going to leave some trimming marks there. I'm actually going to add trimming marks to the side of the bowl too, even though I don't technically need to make it any thinner. And also I have to be very careful because on the thinner parts, it is very thin. But yeah, I think this is beginning to look really nice. And definitely, this is going to make it a lot lighter. It's going to round off the top. I don't want any sharp edges up here. That's a little bit tricky because, as we talked about when we expanded this, it's not completely even, which is fine. But I just want to make sure that it's not too bumpy and there's no sharp edges. That's the most important. At this point, it's sort of a trade-off between getting the right thickness, so it's light enough, and also getting the right shape, because I mean, I want a nice shape, but I also want the thickness to a good level. So sort of light. I don't think I'm going to trim off more. I think it looks good. So now we're going to cut it loose and trim the foot. It actually feels sort of light already. That's a good sign. And before you turn it around, just make sure that your wheel head is clean, because if there's any clay here, it's gonna stick to the pot. Also, this scraps inside, you can lightly try and dust it. Don't try and get everything off. You just want the loose parts off so it doesn't go down. You see there's still a little bit left. I'm just going to let it dry, and then it's going to be much easier to remove it without damaging the pot. Turning around a pot like this can be a little bit tricky, because if you just hold on to the sides, it may collapse. So I'm just trying to gently do it, and don't slam it on the wheel head. That will break it too. So just going to secure it with some clay, because I'm not going to turn down here, of course, at all. I don't want to ruin the beautiful textures that we just made. And first thing, as always, just leveling the foot. So this is actually not so thick. I don't know if you can hear it, which is fine, because I'm actually not gonna take anything off here. I'm just gonna trim a foot, let me see here, directly into this. And trying deliberately not to take away this glaze catcher that I made. Just taking just a little bit off. So it's going to be a discreet foot. But now we have this glaze catcher because we're going to glaze down here, and because the glaze is going to pool in the carvings, it will run. But now we have this sort of a glaze catcher here, and I think that should be enough to make sure that we don't glue it to the kiln shelves. So now we'll do the foot rim. I have to be a little more careful with this one because it's not so thick. Still have a little bit more, but it's not so much. And again, I'm trying to keep sort of a same flow from the side into the foot. For anybody who turns it around, it just makes it look more organic, more natural in a way. I don't know if you can hear it, but it's getting on the thin side now, so I have to be very careful. It's a matter of experience, not cutting through. I cut through a bunch of balls. Not so much anymore, but in the beginning when I was trimming my foot. And again, I'm just going to smoothen the edges here, because if you have sharp edges, there's a high risk that it's going to chip off when they are in use. And we don't want that. So now I'm just going to smooth it a little bit. And at this stage, because it is very thin, be very careful. I think we're done with this one, except for one thing, of course. I need to add my maker's mark. Just make sure that it didn't bump the foot rim. I think it's good. Remove the clay. And again, when you lift it, be careful. Yeah, it feels good. I mean, it's not a super light bowl, but it doesn't feel unnecessary heavy. And look, I think it looks good. The profile is good. So now, just need it to dry. The next kind of texture is what I call a scratched texture, because you can basically scratch it with anything. I love these ones that I get from hardware stores. I don't know exactly what they're used for, but they work great. Or you can use something from a pottery store. They tend to be more expensive, and I prefer, not because I don't want to pay that, but I like to go hunting in hardware stores or kitchen stores or in your sister's beauty box. You know, brushes and combs are great tools, although I will recommend that you don't put it back into the beauty box again, because after you use it for clay, I think you're getting problems with you put it back. So don't do that. Kitchen, just a fork can work. This, I have no idea what it's used for, but it leaves a nice surface and yeah, all kind of things. But today I'm gonna be using this one. Leaves really nice textures. Also the combs are really, really good. They leave nice textures. But this one is gonna be today. For this, I'm going to throw about 2 kilo, maybe a little bit more, maybe 2.5 kilo. Don't know what that is, 5 pounds, something, because I'm gonna try and do more like a vase shape for this one. I'm not gonna spend too much time showing you how I do the basic cylinder, because that's what we're gonna do again, and you're gonna see that over and over again. So I'm gonna move fast forward with this. For this sort of texture with a scratcher, you don't need the walls to be as thin as you would with the carving, because you're not taking away as much clay. Also for this, because it's going to be a vase, I'm going to leave the upper part without texture, because I'm going to make it a sort of a roundish body, but then I'm going to narrow in the neck and make it like an elegant sort of vase. So in order to have sort of like a guide for where I'm going to do, I'm just going to make a small mark here. This is where I will take my scratching to. So now we're going to do the same as we did with the carving, except we're just going to scratch. And I think for this one, I'm going to use the small scratcher. You could also use the big one. I'm going to use the small. I'm trying to aim for about this high, but I'm starting down here. And then I'm going to stand up, because it's a lot easier when you do that. Just going to do one scratch. Actually, I'm going to go the other way around. Just remove the clay in between. And you see, it's not as deep. It is sort of deep, but not as deep as the carving widget. I'm just using my hand to try and hold it a little bit. It will be pushed out of shape when you do this. But we can fix that in a second. And again, same thing as before. There's going to be a lot of little clay crumbles. Don't worry about that, because they're going to dry fast, because they're very small pieces. And once they dry, you can just wipe them off. If you try and do it now, you're going to mess up the texture you just did, because it's going to smudge into the clay. So keep your hands off. I know it's difficult, but also now, of course, we can't touch it from the outside, and I don't want any water on this, because that's gonna smudge up the surface too. And now I said that we push it out of shape, but it's actually not that bad. If it was, you can now sort of use your hand on the inside and get it a little bit back in shape. So now you can start stretching it, and I mean, you can do it from down, and you can do it from up. I'm going to hold back on the rim a little bit, because, as I said, I want a narrow top. So I'm going to hold back on that. Just going to expand a little bit here. And just go slow. Don't try and expand it too fast. I'm trying to use as much as my hand as a rib on the inside. Not to put, like if you just use the finger, it will very easily poke through. It is sort of sensitive with this. I'm trying to control the top, because again, I don't want that to be too wide. Now you can already see how much it stretches out the textures. And again, you have to be careful about how much you stretch it, because suddenly you're going to go through. Now lean back a little bit, see if the shape is right. I think it needs to be a little wider down here, and it can definitely be wider here in the middle. So at this point, you may want to use a rib, because again, it's going to leave a more equal pressure to the wall. So because if you push with like too much on one spot, you very easily break through, and of course you don't want that. Unless you do want that, but I don't. See, now we're getting there. Needs to be a little bit wider here on the shoulder, I think. And again, you have to be careful, because you can only expand. You can't make it any smaller, because we can't touch it on the outside. Yeah, I think it still needs a little work on the shoulder. One of the things when you work with textures is that it can be a lot more confusing to see the shape because it gets distorted by the texture, and it's just difficult to see it. But I think we're getting close to something now. Yeah, I think maybe just a little bit more in the middle. It's always about the contrast, because if I made this more narrow, it will also feel more bulky. So I'm just going to try and see what happens here if we push it in a little bit. Yeah, I actually think that it's wide enough. It's got a nice, elegant feel to it. So I think I'm actually not going to touch the body so much more. So now I'm going to work on the top. Make sure that your tools are not wet, because they will drip down here, and that's going to distort the texture. I want to have a more defined separation between the texture and the clean and smooth surface of the rim. Also, that's going to work as a great way to catch the glaze. And now the problem now is that it's sinking down a little bit, so I'm going to raise this shoulder just a little bit. Yeah, I think that I want to preserve that curve. I think we're getting closer now. And as you may have noticed, I'm not using any water now. I'm dry throwing. And when you do that, when you do dry throwing, it's important that there is no water, because if you suddenly hit an area with water, or you have areas where there's some water and areas where there's no water, it's going to create a different friction, and then it's going to distort. So just going to try. Now for the final part of it, I'm going to use this wonderful mud tools sponge. And now it's actually a good thing that it doesn't hold so much water, because again, I don't want any water dripping down the side. Of course, right now it's annoying to see all these little pieces of clay, and it's so, you want to touch it and you want to remove it, but please don't, because I'm going to smudge it, and it's so easy to remove when it's dry. You could blow dry it a little bit now, but I'm not going to do that. I will try and be patient, even though it feels very unnatural to me. So I think we have a pot. As you can see, these textures have a little bit of swirling, so it's like I pushed it from one side to the next, but not so much. I would like it to be even more, but I think it's okay. Maybe I still had too much smoothness on the inside, too much border. Going even more dry should drag it even more. But I think it's okay. This sort of texture looks really, really good when you apply some wash. So you apply very watery wash, and then you wash it off. So it's only going to be in the grooves. And then you give it sort of a light glaze. So whatever you put in there, for example, copper carbonate will be good, so it will be greenish. And you can have a sort of like a light glaze. And that's going to make it really stand out. You can also use a black stain and wash it off. It will also create some strong visual impression of the texture. And then on the top, the contrast to this texture, have a smooth and nice glaze. Whatever you want to do. You could also just give it one glaze all over. It will also be nice. I will turn this around and trim. I left very little in the bottom, but it's easy just to turn this upside down and just, perfect the foot just a little bit. But I think the overall shape is good. Do you like this texture? Leave a comment if you do. Or if you hate it, leave a comment too. Now it's sort of leather hard, and some of these crumbles have dried. So you can see now they're quite easy to chip off. I'll let it dry a little bit more before I remove the last ones, because I don't want these sticking out, but I still want, a strong texture. So now it's time to do some trimming. I'm actually not going to do a whole lot of trimming on this one, but I do want to exaggerate the rim a little bit. So I'm gonna make this more clean, the separation between the smooth part and the carving of the texture. I want to make that more distinct. I think it's sticking out better now. And then I want to cut in a little bit here. It's very thick here, and I want to have a little more distinct rim. So now you see it stands out a little better. The foot more or less looks good. I just want to make sure that we have a clean cut here. If you're ever in doubt how thick your button is before you do the trimming, you can use, I made this very simple tool. It's just 2 rulers. I made a hole in one of them. So you put it over here, and then you measure the inside first. And this is 20.3 centimeters. So 20.3 centimeters. And then you measure the outside. And it's 20.3, 21, 21 and a half. So I have about 1.2 centimeters of thickness in my foot. So now I know I can trim maybe 8 millimeters or something and still be safe. It's a very simple technique. Oh, it actually feels very light. I'm almost kind of surprised, but a good surprise. And it's even going to be lighter after we trim the foot a little bit. So as always, I'm first going to level the foot. And then I will mark the outside of the rim. This is also a good way to see that it's centered, and it is, because I can see now the rim is equal size. It's a little bit soft here, but that's always the case when you have a pot on the bed, and then when you remove the bed, it is going to be a little bit soft. So that's okay. It's actually very, very thin in there, so I can't take out anymore. I almost cut through. And so I'm going to leave a little bit of pattern in there. You could say it's a design feature, but the reality is I'm almost cutting through the button. And this is actually surprisingly light. After it dries, it will be very, very light. Scratched, textured pot, or vase in this case. So now we just need to dry it. Even though I just told you that I love to go hunting for interesting tools that can scratch and carve and do funny things with textures in hardware stores, in kitchen stores, and even in your sister's beauty box, I do also like some commercial tools. And one of them is the Steve tool. I love that name. It's actually a very simple tool. I bought mine in scarver.com. I think if you search for the Steve tool Pottery, I think maybe you can find a local one that have it too. It's basically this plastic handle, and then you have, just a second here, then you have a lot of dices, I don't know what they call these plastic widgets, that you can screw on to the handle. I put on 3 of them, and they rotate independently. They're basically 2 types, this star-like and this pointy one. I like the stars most, but that's a matter of taste, and you can mix them, and you can have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, whatever. I put 3 on, and as you can see, it's quite deep. I mean, depending on how hard you pressure into the side of the pot, you can actually make some really dramatic textures with this, and I love dramatic textures. So I'm going to use this today, but for this video, or for this part of the video, and the next 2 textures, so the remaining 3 texture examples in this video, I'm not going to show you how I throw the cylinder, because I'm always going to throw a cylinder before I do these expandable textures. I'm probably not going to show you so much about the trimming either, because that's essentially the same. So the last 3 textures, I'm going to be focusing on the actual texture. I already made one cylinder, so let's take a look at that. As you may be able to spot, 2 things about this. It's got the shape that will turn into a vase. It's not so tall, and I made this part down here that's going to be the foot. So it's just going to be the middle part that I do texture on, and not on the very top, because I want to have a clean rim. Another thing is, it's super thick. It's maybe about almost 1 centimeter, and that's because I want to do some very dramatic textures with this. And of course, the more dramatic you want to make it, the thicker it has to be. It's just logic. This is not as dry as the ones I do when I carve into it. It's okay that it's a little bit wet. It's not wet. I scraped off all the slip, so it's just like freshly thrown. What you do is you put it into the side. You can have it both ways. It depends a little bit. I think I need it this way because I need to get all the way down here. And then you run it around to whatever height you want. And then you can actually take it several times. So let's just try and see. And you're not trying to actually make a pattern here. See, now we got all these kind of spread out cuts into the clay. And that could be fine. You can just do that. I'm going to go a little more crazy with this and give it another round. And see, now it becomes more, I would say interesting, but it's just going to be more cuttings. Need a little more down here. And like always, when I do textures, I like to support the inside just a little bit. I think maybe we can do a little more. You can also put it on an angle, maybe. Yeah, now we're talking. Look at that. Just need a little more down here. Yeah, that's what I like. Maybe a little bit higher here. So, this is dramatic. So, now I will expand it. And as usual, well, maybe you should remember to clean this before you move on, because of course the clay sticks in here. So it's nice to get that cleaned. So now we do what we usually do and just expand from the inside. Again, you can't touch it on the outside. Same thing as always when we do these expandable textures. For this texture, I don't need it to swirl around, so I can use a little bit of water on the inside, which sort of makes it easier. And we are aiming for a bowl shape. So I will start expanding it in the top and move down. And just take it easy. Don't rush it, because if you do too much at a time, the pot may break for you. See, that's really cool. I love that. And as always, watch out for the thickness, or how thin it gets, because you do have these cuts in, and it's difficult with this sort of texture to measure how much clay do I have left. But I think I still have quite a lot. So I'm going to use my rib. Once it opens up, it's easier to, it's easy to get access with the rib, and the rib applies a more even pressure. So on the other hand, with the rib, you don't have a feel for how much clay you have left. It's a little more tricky with the rib. Oh, I would say there's good and bad things with the rib, but at this stage of the throwing, I like the rib. Also because we get rid of all the slip inside, and because it's easier to get a continuous curve. And I like the inside of the bowl, as dramatic as it is on the outside. I like it to have, peace and quiet on the inside, and just look nice. So now you see, with the rim, with a rib, it's also easier to expand without adding more water. As always, be very careful if you add water not to add any out here, because then it will like smudge and it just won't stand out. With the rib, it's much easier to do dry throwing, because with your fingers they tend to stick to the clay, and it's just a lot more difficult, I think. I think I need to push it out a little bit more down here, but I have to be careful not to do too much. And as we talked about before in previous videos, even though lots of potters will tell you never to trim the inside of a bowl, I don't care about that. Do whatever works. And for heavy textured pots like this, where it's very difficult to make sure it doesn't get too thin, I would rather stay on a little bit of the thick side, and then if it ends up being too heavy, I just trim the inside of the bowl. It works great. So don't listen to naysayers and people who claim you can only do things in a certain way. I think I may want it to go out a little bit more at the top. There's plenty of clay to go. Another great thing with this shape of rim is that this shape, I think, is perfect for the corner of the bowl on the inside. So it's much easier to get that right. Yeah, just want a little bit more. And I think I may want to do that by hand. And then if you use a sponge, be very careful not to get any water dripping down, because it just doesn't look so good. I also want to make the edge between the texture and the top clean rim a little more distinct. Something like that. And as always, I'm going to end up with my favorite mud tools sponge, which is not really a sponge in a way because it doesn't soak up any water, but it's very, very fine particles. So it leaves my surface very, very smooth. As I said, I may end up trimming the inside. I will judge that after it's dried and to see how heavy it is and if the walls are too thick after this texture. So I think that looks good. The next kind of textures we're going to do is what I call roller textures. There's all kinds of rollers. The most simple ones are these. You roll up the side or you roll it on the slab. Some people also use these just made of a rope. Also leave a texture, and you can make your own. More well known is probably these kinds of rollers. And I think they're originally made for texturing paint on a wall or something, but they're good. The plastic ones, they're very cheap. But my preferred one, by far, is the ones made by MKM tools. And these ones are made in wood, and they come in all sorts of wonderful patterns. And they are very sturdy, and they're very beautiful. And you roll them with this handle. The thing about the roller textures in wood is that wood is very sticky when it's dry. So you need to keep them in water, and you can just keep them in your bucket of water. The more they soak up the water, the better, because then they don't stick to the clay. Just like the last texture, I'm not going to show you how to do the cylinder, because you've already seen that. So I already made a cylinder. So let's take a closer look at that. For the purpose of this video, I didn't make it so big. One thing with the roller textures is that the texturing is not so deep. So you want to make your cylinder a little bit thinner, because except for the expansion you're going to make, it's not going to be thinner. And for a vase, it's hard to trim inside. So whatever thickness you create now, that's what you get. Now you could just roll it up, but the problem is if you do that, it's gonna put a lot of pressure on the cylinder and it's gonna be very uneven. So a nice trick is to put a tube inside it. I found these tubes, I think they're made for plumbing, very useful for this. The problem is if you put the tube inside now and you squeeze a clay close to that, it's going to be almost impossible to remove. At least you're going to distort the cylinder when you do it. And that kind of defeats the whole purpose. So in order to avoid that, there's a neat little trick. I didn't invent that. I think it's, I got it from Hussein Lin. I probably don't pronounce his name the right way, but I'll put a link to his channel. You may already know about him. He's a wonderful potter. And he made, I think, 500 videos or something. So it's got a lot of things in there. But this is a little one of his tricks. I don't know if he invented it, but I learned it from there. It really got to do with wrapping newspaper around it. So you get a layer between the pot and this tube, whatever tube you use. And not only that, we put 2 layers because then they can glide into each other and it makes it very easy to remove the tube and then take out the paper. What I found is that it's nice if the inside is pretty dry. So before I do that, I'm just going to dry it a little bit. So you need 2 pieces of newspaper, and this is actually a little bit too long. And basically just roll it around a little bit longer because you're going to wrap it up inside here. And of course, you need to make sure that that it's long enough to cover your pot. And I think, let me just measure. Yeah, I think this is going to work fine. You're going to fold it in here. And I usually add a little bit of slip just to sort of glue it. Let me just add some water. And now it's in place. So that was the first layer. Very simple. Take the next layer. That's a little bit too long. So you put the second layer on and just wrap it around as tight as possible. And same thing, just going to add a little bit of slip here. Acts as a glue. So there, and fold it in. You want to fold it in nicely so you don't distort the bottom of your pot. Now we're ready to do the rolling. I always start out with the pot a little bit bigger than my tube. I put it in and try and place it sort of in the middle. And then I wet the outside, not the inside, but the outside a little bit. And then I try and squeeze it in so it's close to my cylinder or my tube. Because otherwise it don't offer much support. And you want to start from the bottom because otherwise you're going to trap air in there. So, and then I'll just clean the surface because we want a clean surface that's going to leave better marks. As I said, these marks are not very deep, usually at least. So you want something that's a clean surface. So, and I keep it, now you can't see it there, but I just keep the roller in my water bucket. Before you start rolling, just tap it so you get rid of the water. You don't want it to drip in water, but you want the wood to be soaked so it doesn't glue. And then you hold on to a tube and start from here. I'm going to stop a little bit before because I want to make a nice neck on this vase. So you push in. Like this. And then the next one. Now I'm going to make them so they are closely together. You can also, depending on the pattern, you can also have a little bit of space between them. That's totally up to you. I used stoneware for all these textured pots, but especially for these ones, it looks wonderful if you make it in porcelain, because porcelain shrink a lot, and that will make these types of patterns even sharper. So you may want to try that. So now we have it all around. Now comes the tricky part of of removing the tube. But as you see, this one actually goes out really, really easy because there's no friction. It was inside the paper. The most tricky part is removing the newspaper. But I found if you sort of bend it a little bit like this, it becomes stronger, and you can, if you're lucky, you can get everything out in one move. We got everything out. If there's a little bit of paper left, it doesn't matter. It's going to burn off in your bisque fire. And now it looks nice. The top, of course, got distorted a little bit, but that's easy enough to fix. So now we have a clean top. And again, like always, be careful with water, because if you drip water down here, it's going to distort the texture. So again, when we expand this, you want to go slow, and I'm going to try and see if I can do it dry, because then we will get more distortion because of the torque. Yeah, see, I'm pulling it, so it's swirling a little bit. My theory is it's because when it's dry, I create more torque and I pull it more. I don't know if that theory holds, but at least that's what I found. I want to keep the top narrow because we're going to get that in the end. And it's easier if we sort of keep it not too wide. You see, now it's swirling a lot actually. It's really nice. Now you have to decide on what kind of shape you want, of course. And as always, try and feel how much you can expand the clay, because at some point your fingers are going to go through and you want to stop before that. I guess I want. Oh, I think it's beginning to look really nice. As always, when you work with textures, try and move back a little bit, because the texture kind of distort your view a lot, and it's just difficult to, I find it's difficult to see what the shape is actually. You want to feel and see if you can get a sense of how much thickness you have left. I think I do have a little bit. I may want to go to one of my ribs. Again, with the rib, you apply a little more of an equal pressure, so it sort of reduces the risk of breaking through a little bit. On the other hand, you don't have the feel of your fingers, so there's good and bad things about the ribs. But I always end up using the rib at some point in the shaping. It's always tricky with the shoulder and this part just before the neck to get it raised enough, I think. I think we are slowly getting there. And again, as I talked about before, the more narrow the neck is, the wider the body is going to feel. And I don't think I can stretch this much more if I still want a waterproof vase. I think that's it for the stretching. And now just need to adjust the neck. And for that, I do need to wet it a little bit on the inside. I just don't want to drip it down on the bottom because very soon it's going to be difficult to get my hands in there. And again, like the other ones, I want to make the separation between the texture and the surface, the even surface up here, a little more distinct. And now for the final touch, I want to use my mud tool sponge to sort of smoothen it all. Yeah, I think that looks good. I just want to smoothen my rim here. So here you have a textured vase. I like that. I will be trimming a little bit of a foot down here, not so much, because again I don't want to. I want the texture to be on the whole body, so it's just going to be something like this. And now by marking it with my finger, I'm pushing up a little bit of clay, and that's going to work as a glaze catcher. And you always want to be careful because every time you have textures, the glaze is going to pool in the deep areas, and that will, for some glazes, make them more runny. But I think they should be good. It's a nice little vase, and it's still sort of circular. The last kind of texture we're going to do is actually one of the first ones that I ever did, and that is using sodium silicate. I don't know if you heard about that. It's also called water glass or vandglas in Danish. You can buy it in most hardware stores, maybe a paint shop. You can also buy it in some pottery stores if you want to pay 2-3 times more. I don't, so I buy it the cheapest way in a hardware store. And it's very cheap. I think for this whole bottle I paid a couple of dollars or something. Very cheap. It's fluent when you buy it like this. The easiest way to apply it is with a brush. And I usually just put a little bit in a bowl. It's easier to access. And just do. If I figure out how to open this, they always make it so child-proof, don't they? Anyway, just put a little bit here. It is, yeah, well, sort of like cream or something. Fluid, but still kind of thick. Just like the other two textures I did, I already made a cylinder. This is going to be a bowl, and not like the vase I mistakenly said in the last video, but this is for a bowl. And I want to apply it with a brush, and I want to apply it to the middle part, so I'm still going to leave a little bit up here uncrackled. I like that just as the Steve tool crackled bowl we made. So try not to drip too much. If it dries up on your bed or your wheel head, it's very difficult to remove. So let's just be a little bit careful. But it's very easy to apply, and it's easy to see where you applied it. It looks like water just, and it's not. It's I don't know where it comes from. It's called sodium silicate, and when it dries, it becomes hard like glass, and so that doesn't move when you expand the bowl, and therefore it creates these wonderful random type of crackles. The more you add, the thicker the layer, and the more you dry it, the more dramatic the crackles are going to be. I think this is going to be good. Now, before we move on, as I said, you don't want this stuff on your wheel head or on your bats. So I'm just gonna clean it, and I don't want it here. So, like that. Now we have it there in the middle part. So anything left, yeah. And then we need to dry it. And again, the more you dry it, the harder it gets, and the more dramatic the crackles will be. When you apply it, it's shiny, it's wet like water. And then when you dry it, it will slowly get more and more matte. So that's a way to see how much you dry it. So now you can see, I don't know if you can see it, but it's definitely matte. Just make sure you have dry fingers. And now it feels not sticky. I will give it a little more because I want the most dramatic effect for you guys to see. Yeah, I think that's going to be good. You also don't want to dry it so much that your whole pot is going to get too stiff. Now for this one, I'm not looking for the swirly effect, so I can use a sponge on the inside. And it is a little more easy to wet dry than it is to dry throw. So now we're just slowly going to expand. And just like we did with the other ones, take it easy, there's no rush. Now you can already see we're getting some crackles, and there will be more when we expand it more. See, it's beautiful. Now we're going to use my green rib, as always. I like to do the first opening with my fingers. I think it's difficult to get access with the rib and to begin with, but now it's just easier to make it smooth with the rib. You see? And now we're beginning to get these bigger cracks, and that's what you have to be careful about, because that can go wrong and it can break the whole pot. So gotta take it easy. Yeah, it's just opening up a little bit. That's fine. I don't want it to be completely even. Again, I'm not interested in creating some machine-like pot. I'm interested in doing something stand out as unique and handmade. For this kind of crackle, you don't need the pot to be super thin. But again, I like my textured pots to start out being a little too thick with the bowls, because, as I said, I can trim it inside and make it thinner. It's a different thing with the vases because I can't really trim that on the inside. So but even though I will probably also trim this on the inside, I'm still trying to get the most perfect shape I can, make it smooth and nice, especially getting that continuous round curve. When you're doing crackled textures on bowls, you have to consider how wide you make it or how tall. Because, I mean, if it's a very shallow bowl, you won't see that outside texture. So I want to keep it at a certain height so you can really enjoy all that texture work. Yeah. I think we need to go a little more out in the lower part. Yeah, that looks better. Now it's fine down here, but it's too vertical here, so I want to push that out a little bit. And I think I can do that. Yeah. I think the basic shape of the bowl is nice now. I think I'll just go and work a little bit on the rim. And again, like we talked about before, you don't want any water dripping down here, because if there's water dripping down on the sides, it's going to distort the beautiful texture that we just made. So working with the sponge, you have to be very dry as sponges get. And I think I'm going to take this rib that have like an angle here. It's very good for separating the texture from the more clean surface rim. So something like that, I think looks good. I think I'm gonna use my mud tools sponge. I talked about it quite a few times in this video, and I really do like it. It creates this smooth surface. A lot of my other sponges are a little more rough, and they suck the water better, but they also, they make the surface a little more rough. I think that's it. I really like the way that this texture sort of look like the desert on a dry day. There's a couple of really nice variations you can make with this this technique, sodium silicate technique. One thing is that you can add an engrobe or slip before you add the sodium silicate. So that will make the slip crack. So if you, for example, if you have a very white clay and you add a black slip and then you add the sodium silicate, the black will crack and reveal the light clay underneath it. That can be really beautiful. You can also add a thicker layer of slip, like a whole, like maybe 0.5 centimeter or something, and then let that dry, and then put the sodium silicate on. Or, as I did sometimes, mix up a slip with the sodium silicate and apply that and dry it. It takes a little more to dry it because, of course, it's a thicker layer of slip. That can crackle up and create these almost, it almost looks like bark on a tree or something. I think I may have an example somewhere here of things that I did in the past. Some of them were wood-fired, and that even, emphasized the drama in it. It's, of course, very different than this. But the whole point of the sodium silicate is the fact that it dries and becomes like glass, and it breaks when you expand. And you can play around with that idea in a whole lot of ways. Of course, you should never use this on the inside, because it's going to make it very food unsafe, because bacteria can hide in all these cracks. But that goes for most of the textures we do. It's for the outside or for vases of decorative purpose. But all in all, I think this vase, bowl, I'm saying vase all the time, this bowl turned out really nice. So let's go and take a look at the table and look at all the pots that we did in this video, and how I also did some trimming to make them look better and to be lighter. That was all the textured pots for today, at least. I'll probably make some more videos with the textures, because I really do love what it do to pots. Now they are almost bone dry, and as I said, there's some crumbles on the surface, especially when you do like this type of texture. As you can see, there's still some crumbles left. I do want strong texture, but I don't want these sticky crumbles. So, as I said, you shouldn't remove them when the clay is still wet, because then you're just going to smudge it in. But at this point, I don't know if you can see it here, but at this point, it's very easy to remove it. So you can just grind your finger over it. And that way you can remove those parts that are sort of sticking out. I like to do that because it's just if you have like very sticky parts like that, when you glaze, they become sharp, and it almost becomes dangerous to move the pot around. So that's the last finish I do before I put them down in my dry room and get ready for bisque fire. But just to just to highlight a few tips, as we talked about in the video. If you want them to be light, and I mean the question always is, how light should a pot be? In my opinion, I mean there can be different opinions about that, but in my opinion a pot should have the weight that you expect it to be. So if you take, for example, this one with the Steve tool, very heavy texture, you would expect it to be heavy. In my case, it's actually not heavy because I trimmed it so much on the inside, which goes against my recommendations here. But I don't think a pot could be too heavy, except when it comes to vases. These ones are not so tall, but if you have a very tall vase and you put a dried flower in it or something where you don't have water, it becomes a little bit unstable. Same thing goes for the table lamps I do. The first ones I did was actually quite light. And then when you put the light and the shade and everything on it, it's almost tipping over. So you do need some weight for that. And a vase that you fill up with water, I mean, it doesn't matter what the vase itself weighs, because all that water is going to make it heavy anyway. But I think for bowls, bowls that you pass around the table, it's nice that they're not too heavy. It's just easier to use. And of course for cups and small breakfast bowls and things, I like them to be light. But that again is a question of taste. Another thing I wanted to highlight, I also told you so in the video, is that if you do want them light, especially with the bowls, I suggest that you make the wall a little bit thicker when you throw it, because when you add the texture, it's risky that you can break through if it's too thin, and then it's totally broken. Also, by making it a little thicker, it's more stable. So when you push whatever tool you're using into the side of it, it doesn't warp as much. So then if you want it to be lighter, in the end, you can always trim it on the inside as I did. Of course, that's not possible with the vases, at least I don't know how you would trim a narrow-necked vase on the inside, but for the bowls, it is indeed possible, and I'll suggest you do that. I hope that you find this video inspiration. Of course, you can go ahead and do exactly what I did here, or try and do that. But I hope that you will go and hunt for interesting tools to do textures. Go to flea markets, go to kitchen stores and hardware stores, search your own home around, find things that could make interesting textures, and see what it does when you expand them. Go crazy, I like it. If you enjoyed this video, I hope that you will subscribe, like, and press that little bell button so you'll be notified about news videos. I will, however, every Sunday I will have a new video. It's about 5 o'clock. It will premiere Central European time. It's a little bit earlier on the US side, of course, a little bit later in Asia. But if you don't make the premiere, you can always come back and watch it. It will stay here forever. That's all I had for today. I hope to see you soon again, and have a good day.